for our generation, we have to filter ourselves to stop and be curious and not give our opinion, but sit, listen, and learn, and allow your generation to experience life as you can in this new world that we have that didn't exist for us, and not try to rescue you. You know, if you fall, you fall. If you fail, you fail. You pick up and you move forward.
You're listening to the Talking 20 podcast. This podcast is for you if you're in your 20s and you're thinking, what the hell am I doing? We've all been there and we want to talk about it. We're your hosts, Bridget O'Rourke and Mary Margaret Courtney, and we sit down with fellow millennials to chat about their journey and hear what they've learned along the way. Let's get started. Welcome to another episode of Talking 20. This episode is going to be a little bit different because Mary and I have decided that we don't necessarily want to only chat with millennials. We want to dig into other generations as well and talk about their journey of their 20s and compare them to the 20s that we're going through right now. So today we have an extra special guest joining us, someone who has hustled throughout her 20s and beyond to get to where she is today, building a strong career while raising 3 mediocre children. I'm just kidding. 3 very inspiring children who were born during her mid-20s. She's strong, confident, and adept at getting shit done, and we're super excited to have her on the show. Here is Brenda Courtney, also known as Mary Margaret's mother.
Hello.
Hi, ladies.
Okay, so Mom, when you first heard that Bridget and I were doing this podcast, what was your first thought?
Awesome. To me, it spoke so much to who the two of you are today as young adults, as well as who you were as very young, spontaneous children who lived your life quite fearlessly. And that may not have always felt like it was on the inside, but to those of us outside, you were, the fierce children who were okay to take risks and be able to say to people, hey, we're going to give this a shot. And if we fall, we fall. And if we don't fall, that's great too. So it just seemed like a natural fit for the two of you.
Also 2 children who never stopped talking.
Yeah.
So were there any certain topics that piqued your interest when you heard the concept?
Any specific topics? Well, I think we can't avoid talking about the pandemic, right? There's enough challenges for kids and, young adults in their 20s. And you add this layer on of a pandemic. You add on all the things that have been going on in the world, that's happening globally. Everything that happened in the first year of the pandemic and south of the border in the States with Black Lives Matters. And you look now in Canada where we have been talking the truth and reconciliation processes, right? Looking at our Indigenous communities and trying to elevate that conversation. And now in the midst of the pandemic, and as we're just starting to be hopeful of coming out of that, we are having to truly face the horrors of what happened in our own country. And I think as a young generation, we were not educated on the history of the Indigenous people in our country. And I think for a lot of people in their 20s, it's a whole other layer of realization of what's happened here in our own land. So all of that, I thought, wow, you guys, you got content.
So do you think that, because we have more access to information, do you think that's why we're more educated on it now and why we can talk about it? Is it because of social media? Is it because we can put stuff out there? Why did you not have access to that information? Why is it all coming out now, in your opinion?
Well, I think there's 2 reasons. And absolutely. I mean, the access to information, I think about that, just raising children and all of those pieces. I mean, we did not have at our fingertips the information that your generation has. So it opens up the conversation. But I think, unfortunately, there are some things such as truth and reconciliation and the work that they have been trying to bring forward in our generation. That history was silenced and there was no way to bring it forward. The platforms weren't there. So absolutely, I think as I said, you have content because there is such access to so many different topics. And I also, because of the internet and social media, we're getting courageous. All ages are getting more courageous. And, as young women, as an older woman, just yesterday, I was on Instagram and something came up and it was like, we have to destigmatize having your period. Put it out there, ladies. There's a platform to do that. That platform didn't exist.
Yeah, my hope in that is that it brings these generations together. And we're going to talk more about that later. But it's true. Like, we're bridging that gap and we're finding ways to have information accessible. And my hope is that the older generations can try their best to relate with our generation, because it is, in our opinion, very different. And so, yeah, like hearing people like you able to say like, hey, you guys have a lot of power and inspiration and information, like do something with it. Where I think a lot of our generation has fear that we won't be heard by those older generations because they can't understand.
Yeah.
In your opinion, Brenda, what do you think people in older generations should understand about our generation? What kinds of topics should we talk about to educate the older generations on how we're moving through our 20s?
When I think about my 3 adult children, I don't know that I could land on one topic. I think that there's a need for our generation. It's something that Dawn and I talk about we need to remain curious. I think everybody needs to remain curious when we are in conversation or in relationship with somebody else. But I think it's specific to that individual. So Bridget, if I'm having an interaction with you, and you say, "Oh, I'm going to do a podcast," I'll be honest. That initial gut reaction for those of us as we age and from generation to generation, we go to "Oh, you can't do that. Everybody's doing that. Who's going to listen to you? Are you getting paid?" Blah blah blah. And that's what comes out, right? And we have to filter ourselves to stop and be curious and not give our opinion, but sit, listen, and learn. And allow your generation to experience life as you can in this new world that we have, that what didn't exist for us, right? And not try to rescue you. If you fall, you fall. If you fail, you fail. You pick up and you move forward. So I really think it's about really whoever we're presented with, whether it's our children, our friends, nieces, nephews, it's spending that time with them. And it doesn't come easy. Doesn't come easy. But it's sitting and listening to hear and to learn. And then to go back and reflect on it. Because any relationship, there's reciprocity in that, right? It's always mutual. And even from our, the youngest children all the way up, my hope is that those in their 20s also do take the time to also sit and seek those of us that might have some wisdom. Like what can you glean from the adults that came before you to help inform some of the decisions that you make and how you look at the world.
Which is why we're interviewing people like you.
Yeah, I always find that my mom, sometimes I'll think something super easy or, I'm going to start a podcast, and then, my mom has to bring back in that wisdom of, okay, but you need to have a backup plan. Like, she has been through her life. She's seen all the hurdles that will come up, and she knows how to guide me properly. So yeah, that's such a big thing.
Yeah.
All right, Brenda, so let's go back to when you were turning 20. You're finishing, I guess for you it would have been your first year of college. What does life look like for you? Relationships, where were you living? What were you doing? What program were you in? Tell us a bit about that.
So, I was studying behavioral science at St. Lawrence College in Kingston, which was about, it's just less than 2 hours from where I grew up in Glengarry County, just outside of Cornwall. I was in a fairly serious relationship at the time. I had a boyfriend for a couple of years, and, spent my time in Kingston going to school, a bit of back and forth. My birthday being at the end of April, I would have, when I turned 20, I would have just finished my first year. I headed back to Cornwall for the 4 months in between before I started my second year. Looking at things short term, it was about what's the plan for the following 2 years, and then what comes after that, right? So, it was interesting because when I was thinking and reflecting on that, it was kind of felt like a blank slate. I was like, I don't know. I went to college. I went home. I got a summer job. And I went back to school in the following September. And like those first 3 years when I was in college, it wasn't until the end of my second year when I actually, when I met Dawn and things took a pretty quick turn and my life went in a bit of a different direction, and, found myself married a year later because that's what we did in the 80s as good Catholic girls.
So you said that you had a very serious boyfriend in your early 20s. Is that Don? Is that your current husband? Or was that somebody else?
That was somebody else.
So what was that a hard transition?
Oh yeah. I mean, as young women in your 20s, you know the ups and downs of relationships and all that comes with that. And yeah, hard decisions, lots of reflection, people supporting your decisions, people not supporting your decisions, and going with, I don't know, where your heart takes you, where your values take you. That's been something that has always guided my decisions, has been, you know, in your 20s, right? You, as Bridget, you said, you reflect on your parents to help guide your decisions. At the time, my, you know, being raised in a Catholic family, and having my Catholic faith guide me at the time, that impacted my decisions. But when my confusing times came, I needed to go to, you know, what do I value? What are my true values? And that helped guide my decisions, and haven't looked back since.
So in that, like, we talk a lot about our early 20s. For Bridget and I, easier to reflect on because it was so close to now. And we talk about like those like first few years of feeling completely lost. But were you loving your program? Were you loving living on your own? Did you feel like you had your shit together in your early 20s?
Did I feel like I had my shit together? I can tell you, yeah, program-wise, I loved what I was doing academically. I liked the program I chose. I chose it because I knew I wanted to go into something social service-wise, but the program I chose wasn't really, it didn't pigeonhole you. You weren't just working with, children within a certain age category. You weren't working just with kids with special needs. The program I studied, there was, people use it in weight management. It allowed a broad spectrum for me. So I enjoyed the learning. I enjoyed the freedom, obviously, which we all do. It all fit very, very well for me. That sense of feeling lost, as scary as that can be, I actually think it's a bit of a gift for your generation. And not that, a lot of people, I'm sure experience that. I think what is different is, we certainly didn't, within sort of my circle, family, friends, peers, there was a path. There was a defined path. You're going to go to school. You're going to get married. You're going to stay home and have kids, hopefully, if you can afford to do that. And boom, boom, boom. This is how it's going to look, right? So you got married right away. You met that person. And even if in a lot of relationships right now, you may know that this is your forever person, but you're not jumping into the engagement, the marriage, and then the kids, right? So I was married at 22, first baby at 24, then 26, and right? Just 1, 2, 3. So there was no time to feel lost.
How do you feel about the path that 20-somethings are taking now and not getting married right away, or maybe living together before they get married, those kinds of things?
Yeah. I think it's a great gift for your generation. I'm not saying I wished I had done it differently. However, I feel when I look at youth today, because the world is smaller for you, you have more, it is easier to travel. You have more knowledge about traveling. Again, it's back to the world of social media and having access to the internet, right? If anything, my advice to people in their 20s is, it isn't a race. It isn't a timeline. Slow down. If you don't go to university now, you can go later. Even career-wise, people get into their, they go to school, they get their credentials, they then get a job, and then they want the next job, and they want the title, and they want the raise.
Mm-hmm.
Chase the experience.
Mm-hmm.
Don't chase the next step, the thing you have to check off on your box. The comparison to where somebody else may be because, well, they're 26 and I'm 26 and they're doing that and I'm not doing that. I don't know. Compare yourselves at 48. That person might still be at 48 where they are where they were at 26. So
yeah, which is hard these days because with social media, it's hard not to compare yourself to other people your age, especially because they're all posting all the good stuff, all the successful moments.
Yeah, and even I think our, in my age range, even 28, I feel like we escaped the intensity of social media in our like younger formative years and teenage years. I couldn't imagine for those younger kids what it would be like to navigate that and not have parents who would understand anything about having a cell phone even in high school type thing. And I think now I agree with you, Mom. It is a gift for us, but there is something that has to change in our expectations in our early 20s, because you talk about like, yeah, you know, you didn't have time to feel lost because you just blah, 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 blah. These were the steps you took. Whether it was religion based or it was just the structure of how you did life, we've fallen out of that structure, which I think is where we're like, we don't even know what those goalposts are supposed to be, because I could sit in a circle with all my friends at 22 and one person's aiming for the marriage and one person's aiming for the next level of school and one person's aiming to travel. Like we all had these different aspirations, but we still had this sense of lost, which I want to quote you. Because although I cannot relate to your life at 20, because if I put me in your shoes, the age I am, I would have a house, 3 children, and a husband, and I have one of those things right now. And I just got it like crazy. But what I can relate to, you sent us a little quote, which we really liked, was, I was bothered by my lack of strength to follow my own values, what I wanted for myself and my family. But I stood in silence because I believed others knew better. So can you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah. You know, I, for the most part, have always been, I think, similar to the two of you, you know, in that I typically know what I want and what feels right, and will stand on that and speak up. I think mainly in those early days of parenting. I'm the 4th of 6 children. Dawn is the 5th of 6 children. And when you grow up in those positions in your family, you always have older siblings who know better than you. They've been there, done that. And you kind of even, you know, there's a part of you that, like, you know, for a long time you think your older brothers and sisters know more than you do. Well, they know more than you do, even more than your parents do, because your parents are too old, right? And raising my children, especially in those preschool years, it started to change for me once they went to school. But I struggled to stand in my conviction of decisions I may have wanted for my kids around even just things like diet, nutrition, right? Without getting people would make comments at the, oh, you're going to be one of those mothers. Oh, and you're like, ugh. And so I would back off. I didn't want to be one of those mothers. So I know that in the early years, and I think it's top of mind for me right now as being a grandmother, 3 young grandchildren, watching my 2 daughter-in-laws and my 2 sons raise their children with great similarity, but they too have their differences, which of course they should, and different from, not drastically different, but differences from how I raise my kids, and watching them stand in their conviction of, this is how we raise our children. This is how we do it. And if you don't like it, that like it's irrelevant, right? And it's not that they don't seek advice or we don't have open conversations, but I wish for myself that I know that the what was the word you used earlier around, you know, those times of uncertainty and feeling lost would have been around times of parenting when I was sort of like, I don't know, do I do it this way? Do I do it that way? Well, I better do it this way because that's what they did it. Not, this is how we feel is the best for our children.
Yeah, which is hilarious because being one of those children who you fed and kept alive, we actually were somehow, you were really ahead of your time on like how we ate and what we ate. Like Lunchables was not a common thing for us. And I never saw it as like a health thing, but now I see people and how they're trying to raise their children and what they're feeding them. And we have more information about health and nutrition. And it's a lot of stuff that you were already doing. And I couldn't imagine, because still now, if you say you're vegan, people might roll their eyes at you or something. But back then, like you would be very alienated to be that parent.
Yeah. It was interesting because I don't even remember where I got this book. It's called Free to Fly. I still have it. And I read it, and it was a story about a mom who had a daughter who got very ill. And so this woman went to the library and she started like researching, and, you know, long story short, it was about coming back to everything that we know more about today on how we eat and even cleaning products. And so at that point, I threw everything out. I used vinegar to clean everything. And there were, people rolled their eyes and people, what do you mean you don't use fabric softener? And then you're kind of like, oh, my clothes don't smell pretty. But that was probably the one thing but I think it was different, right? You're in your own home. It isn't the same judgment as when you're making decisions about, whether your kids have naps or whether they go to bed on time or how you discipline and whether you yell at them or whether you put them in timeouts and all the different things that come with the things that people see publicly and feel that they can comment on.
So at the time, did you know that you were you frustrated with yourself that you were holding back, or do you reflect on it and it's kind of hindsight, oh, I was holding back at that point in my life?
No, I was frustrated with myself then, and is equally frustrated with myself now that I didn't, as I said, I would stand in silence and not, which, people who were around at the time would be, Brenda, silent? Not a thing. But I really mean that in the sense of saying, no, when I ask you not to feed my child Coke, a can of Coke, I'm serious in asking you not to do that. So please don't do that, right? As opposed to being like, well, okay, all right.
And Bridget and I should never have been fed Coke, ever.
Yeah, you were telling people not to give Mary a can of Coke for different reasons than you were telling the other people for your other kids.
She's going to explode, literally explode.
She has too much energy. She can't have any more.
Oh, that's so funny.
Which is funny too. So going back to when you talk about cleaning products and stuff, my college roommates hated that I refused to use Lemon Pledge. And again, now there's Norwex and companies that advocate for chemical-free stuff, but I was literally in college and living with people who were like, no, you're not cleaning if you're just using hot water and vinegar. And it was a genuine argument, and it led to me going, then I just won't clean if you need to, because I refused. The chemicals were so intense to me because we didn't grow up with it, which again seems normal now, but it was not normal then.
Yeah, that's so true.
You have a unique perspective because you not only lived through your 20s and had your kids in your 20s, but you're also seeing your kids now raise babies. So do you think the health side of raising children is the biggest difference, or what do you notice with Cameron and Adam? What's the biggest parenting difference from when you were parenting?
It's interesting. I don't think there's big differences. I see that they are, as I said, they as young couples have, talk about what their family values are and what they want for how they're going to navigate the world with their children. I'm learning. I learn from the four of them every time I'm with them and as their children are going through different developmental stages. And, I'm not a developmental specialist, but I worked in children's services for a long time. It's not like I don't know anything. I'm amazed. I'm amazed at their, I studied behavioral science. I used to help go into family homes and help moms in helping them support, we talked about behavior management, right? How do you get your kid to go to bed at whether 7:30 at night? Because, parents would say, I can't get my kids to go to bed, or whatever their challenge was in front of them. And yet I'm watching them and I learn every day, and I'm amazed to see the outcome on with their children. And again, for our generation, take that opportunity and learn from your children who are raising children. Again, access to information. They read a lot. They have access to the information that, we went and bought the one parenting book.
Yeah. Then do you think that their age has anything to do with the way that they're raising their kids? They were a lot older than you were when you had kids. Do you think there's a difference there? Because they were able to establish themselves as adults before having kids, rather than just going into it right away.
Yeah, I've thought about that. It has to contribute somewhat. I know for myself, I was always so grateful, although I didn't work a long time before I had my kids. But the field that I was in, I had worked in group homes with kids with special needs, and got to figure out how do you manage, and there's two people and there's 5 kids in the home and they have special needs, and you're having to get them up and get them to school. And I learned a great deal, and I brought a lot of that into my own home, raising my kids, and structuring how I just function. So I have to think that for them, having worked, they went to school longer, they quit school, they went back to school, but those life experiences have to have helped them feel more confident, so that they aren't the ones sitting in silence as they parent their kids.
Totally. And access to information. Like, Mom, you had that advantage of working in that industry and having like a work-life relation to be able to like connect the dots and go like, oh, this works in group homes with like people who have high needs and need a lot of help. I could likely take this home to my daughter with ADD and, hopefully have a successful day. But that's a really great opportunity now for people of our age who are, and like you said, Bridge, they're older, they have more life experience, but you have access to information. There are people who have social media accounts dedicated specifically to learning those tools that you went to school for.
Yeah. And as I said, one of my daughter-in-laws, she follows somebody who's local on social media around, parenting and building relationship with your children and attachment things. And, so she has shared that link for me, and I follow that. I read it. Some of it I'm like, oh yeah. And other stuff I'm like, well, that's an interesting way to approach that. And I think that's great. Those are some of the I think the gifts that young parents now have access to that we certainly didn't have access to raising our kids.
So we're talking about some of your valleys and some of the harder times when you were in your 20s. How did you take some of those lows and use that experience in your job with youths?
Even though I didn't realize it when I was younger, especially in my teen years, one of the angst that I carried, and I still carry now, interestingly, Bridget, I just had this conversation with your mother and father the other day. One of the angsts I've always carried is that, that wearing of a mask. Just because we don't know someone's story, like don't assume, right? So we see people who we feel are so successful. Look at them, they got it all together. And recognizing that, I too had my struggles in high school. I had my own mental health struggles. I had my own academic struggles. It wasn't always easy. When you're 50, when you're 55 and a director at an agency, people think, oh, it must have been easy for you. And I remember particularly being in high school, and my kids are somewhat the same, especially Cameron, who became a youth worker, drawn to people who others thought were, that's a bad guy, or she's not a great one, that there was a worry about them. And yet knowing that they had all these strengths, gifts, talents, and just because they weren't the good kid, because that good kid, they've got, Lori Bryan's words, everybody's got their shit, they got their shit too. They're just not, we just don't know about it. Or they, their mask is really intact and they can carry it off. And I brought that to my work. I brought that to my work in supporting families who felt at times shame, families who didn't want their children labeled, families, schools where kids did get labeled because of external behaviors. And I think I was able to bring that to families. I was able to bring that to staff who I supported, who often when you work in this field, you think that, then people would expect you to have it all together, or your kids have it all together. And empathy and sharing stories goes a long way in helping people. So when, there's always boundaries with these things, but I always remember the day I had a grandmother stand up in her living room and put her hands on her hips and wave her finger at me and was very angry, saying to me, do you know what it's like? Do you want to know what it's like to make a decision whether to put your child on medication or not? And I said, oh, yes, I do know that very well. Right? You can bring your own experiences and you don't position yourself as an expert. So I learned that very early on. And I think it's helped me build relationships with the people I was working with, because even when you're in a professional relationship, it's still a relationship.
It just helps build connection. It's all about connecting with other people through experience.
100%. Yeah. And I think that's really important. Like anyone who's listening, and even for myself, for Bridget, I think we need to remember that perspective of show your shit and use it for empathy and connection, because in this world of social media where we're comparing each other, we're all struggling. COVID has just been a year of not connecting with humans and watching their lives on social media. So we're in a danger zone with it. And if we can back up and say, you know, I don't have my shit together, like things aren't that easy. Example A, we talked about it yesterday. Like I, with pride, talk about how I own a house with my parents. There's no way Mary got this house on her own, because I could very easily come across that way, because I do work hard and I've worked a lot. And so I think people just assume, oh, that girl's just killing it. What's wrong with me? And I never want anyone to feel like that. So I put my ego aside and say, no, look, this is the reality of my situation, my life. And I hope more people do that, so that, you know, when I go on social media, I don't start to feel like shit about myself and I can connect with people again. Because yeah, you're right. Everyone's got their shit. And so why not be more authentic and honest? And hopefully that, you know, that's a tool we can all take away.
Okay, so you are recently retired.
Yeah.
Living the dream. And I know that my parents, it was almost like now that they're going into the age where they can retire, they feel that sense of loss again. They feel lost like they did in their early 20s. What happens now? Now what? Do you feel that way?
No.
Or do you feel resolved and you're like, I did it?
No, because I think partly, and there's a number of reasons. One, I don't see that it's retirement, it's done. I am not in any way looking right now for something else. I do believe I will do something again. Might be part-time, it might be some. I do believe I will do some form of work again. I'm young for retirement. I retired at 57. Well, yeah, 57. I was going to come back. I was away and I was going to announce my retirement. And I came back from Jamaica. But when I came back from Jamaica, I got off the plane, had a quarantine for 2 weeks, and we were in full pandemic mode. Not the time to announce your retirement.
I'm out.
And so I delayed it 6 months. So being in this pandemic at this time, that's, you know, I think my sense of loss is the same as everybody who's like, wait, I was going to go to Florida. I can't go to Florida. I was going to do this. Can't do that. And my focus really is, I was just saying to your mom the other day, Bridget, we were putting kayaks in the water. And I said to her, you know, my goal is at 78 to be able to pick up this kayak with my grandkids that are in their 20s, so get it into the water. So I'm barely doing that right now. So if I'm going to do that when I'm 78, I got a lot of physical work to do. So that's my focus. And like I said, I don't think I'm done. I certainly don't feel lost. I feel very privileged. I feel very blessed. And I'm very excited to make space in my life for all the things I never did before.
Bridge, I love that question, because it brought me back to Mom talking about her retirement. And she had exactly what you're saying your parents have. Like you were still questioning, like, but look at all the work that's there to be done. And especially in your industry, like there's always going to be a crisis. And at first it was, you know, a new government came into place that you felt was changing your organization. You wanted to be there to support. And then COVID, like, how could you leave in such a crisis? And you and I had a talk one day about like, okay, but like when is the step to put yourself first? And I think in that comes like a fear of like, you have to jump at some point, whether you're in your late 60s, 70s, whenever you retire, or you're in your early 50s, you've been working for so long, it's so attached to your identity. Of course, there's going to be a fear of loss, and then like a fear that you're not going to know what to do, or like, do I even have friends that will fill that time? Like, I want to exercise, but I don't know how to do that at my age anymore. Like it's a new transition, and like that is a leap of faith.
Yeah. And I love my work. And I think, you know, similar to your parents, Bridget, they like what they do, right? So I think it's easier to make that retirement when you're like, I just can't put another day in. I'm counting down the days. I wasn't counting down the days. I loved what I did. I loved the people I worked for. If someone said, Brenda, you must go back to work today, that's where I want to go back.
What factors contributed to the decision of retiring earlier than the usual 60 and up?
You know, it was really selfish. It was I did not do work-life balance well, as much as I kept setting that as a goal. I kept falling short, and I was really noticing it as I was aging. When you're even at 55, you can bounce back. You can be like, I've done nothing for 3 months because we did whatever, and I'm going to get back on it. It just was getting harder and harder. So, but really, it really was my health. I wanted to be around for my grandchildren. There was the hope, so much the hope of being able to spend more time with my parents, spend more time with my dad, who was in long-term care, and the pandemic didn't allow for that. But
so it was a lot about your health, healthy aging and whatnot. How are you learning about those things?
Well, I have 3 kids that really, yay. So they feed me good information. And they really support it. I'm going to tell you, they really support this, and it's been really nice. They expose me to information. I mean, I don't know how many 58-year-old women have their sons sending them information on ayahuasca and psilocybin, and say, hey, look what's happening in the field of mental health. And I'm like, wow. So they expose me to information, and I'm open to reading it and learning about it, even though sometimes I'm either reading stuff and I'm like, that's whacked, but hey, I'm going to be curious. And I've been seeking out a range, again, podcasts, books, audiobooks. There's so much out there that is allowing me to learn more about overall health and nutrition, but nutrition and health, and how do we stay young, fit, mentally, physically, and emotionally when we're in our late 70s? That's what I want to know. That's what I'm working towards.
I know that a lot of 20-somethings now, Mary and I in particular, really are focusing on our health and want to make sure that we're super healthy and can just be our best selves to be productive. Was that a journey that you had in your 20s, or because you had kids so early you weren't able to do that, or you didn't have the access to the information? Talk about your health journey in your 20s a little bit.
Yeah, I think I was kind of a moderate person. I certainly, I always had a gym membership. And again, it ebbed and flowed depending what my, I would have times when I went consistently and I was, lifting weights and I was really physically strong. And other times, I always seemed I'd take a new job on and then that would drop off for a year and then I'd get back on the horse again. I feel for our generation, I did quite well when it came to health and nutrition. And being physically fit. We always think we need to do better. And it's not just women, it's men too, that want to be able to say, you're in your 20s, you look amazing. Yes, focus on your health and stop worrying about your waist size. Like, stop posing with your picture with your hand on your hip because,
Yeah, and it there's definitely like a whole other conversation to be had about the distortion of like our image based on, Instagram and how things look. I do find that, people are more trying to learn about your physical health with your mental health. And like Bridget and I have talked about that recently, how, of course, we like the effects of how it makes our body look, but we don't get up and put our gym clothes on and go into our workout rooms every day because we want to fit in those shorts and have our stomach showing. It's been a journey for us to be committed to that because of our mental health. You were, again, in the world, so your perspective's different on mental health, but back in your 20s, was there a big conversation about like, hey, maybe you need to like do physical fitness every day because that's going to give you some like mental clarity, some balance, some you time, some meditative practice? Like any of that conversation happening?
Like self-care, was that a thing?
Well, self-care was, but not in the sense, not in the way it is today. And again, what we know today, right? And even when I think back, if you look back into, people would come in, in adults, children alike, right? People are struggling. They may be struggling with their mood. They may be struggling with sleep. And so for a lot of therapists, a lot of counselors, we're unpacking a lot of things that could be driving that. But there was certainly a time, we weren't asking kids and adults about, and if we were asking it, we weren't pushing it enough to say, before you consider X, Y, and Z, and before we're going to unpack and talk about, you're going to go home for 2 weeks and you're going to track your sleep, track what you ate, how much water did you drink, put your damn phone down. Wouldn't say it like that, right? But absolutely, Bridget, we did not in our 20s, and there's always those outliers, but for the most part, what we ate had to do with how we weighed. What we ate wasn't tied, did you eat your broccoli, bagels for breakfast, and grilled cheese sandwich for lunch, and spaghetti for dinner, right? Carbs, carbs, carbs.
Oh, that sounds so good, though.
Yeah, so I think, when I see the work, and those are the things, when I look at my 3 adult children and their partners and their focus on paying attention to what they're eating and their exercise routines, and making sure that each other are building that in, that it's not just about, well, I got to go to the gym. It's making sure that the other person's got time. Your generation, again, yeah, you have access to a lot more information, but you're taking that in. It's incredible, the dedication, I think, and it's important, because you're better able to cope as a parent with your child when you physically feel better inside.
Totally.
And I think sometimes we thought we were doing the right things, but we were not eating the right things.
So we've been talking a lot about the comparison of your 20s to our 20s generations. So do you think millennials are in a tougher position in their 20s, or is your generation thinking, welcome to life, guys, it sucked for us too? Or are we just self-involved in that, or is it really different?
No, I think it's every generation, and people even talk about that again with the pandemic, right? They're like, yeah, but this generation had a world war, and there was, right, all those things. I think it is more, I think it's harder. I think it's more dangerous. And I think it's more dangerous because of social media. The access to information is fantastic, as we've talked about, but I think it's more dangerous. And when I cannot imagine what it must be like as a 16-year-old girl, boy in high school, scrolling at night through your social media feeds when you already feel unsure and uncertain, and your brain's trying to, it's still growing. I think it's harder.
Yeah, Mary and I have talked about that too, where our generation, the millennials, we didn't have that in high school. We didn't have Instagram in high school. That came out when we were in university. So just thinking about how kids are managing, TikTok and Instagram and all that comparison during such an unsure age, I can't even imagine. We're able to scroll at night knowing who we are as a person.
Yeah.
But they're not.
Yeah.
So, Brenda, if you were to go back in time to when you were 20, would you do anything differently?
I don't know that I would do it differently. I would hope that my mindset would be different. That I wouldn't, we talk about, don't worry about what other people think. I think in your 20s, I think, that whole, what do people think? What does your family think? What do your siblings think? What do the neighbors think? And I would want to change that narrative in my head to how am I impacting those around me versus what do people think about me? And Mary and I have talked about this. We can be big personalities. And I spent my life, my adult life, well, even my younger life, not always successful, trying to contain that, trying to pull that back. Because you're too loud, it's not ladylike, you're bothering people. But the message for me was always, then what do they think of me? I would want to change that narrative to, okay, how is my loud voice or my talking too much impacting others? If you're not having a good time because I'm over here yapping, I need to be cognizant of that. I think that would be the one thing in my 20s would be to change that in my head so it's not so self-deprecating. Hopefully I would have felt better about myself.
Yeah, and there's a difference between what you're doing and assuming what people are thinking about you. So it's like, it's that self, like, oh, well, they told me to, tame myself, in Glennon Doyle's words. So they're not accepting me. They're judging me. Versus, like you said, switch that narrative and go like, okay, well, hey, let's stop thinking about what other people think. But like, how are you making other people in the room feel? And that's the way I've had to turn it around, is like, there's a time and place for your big personality. There's a time and place for the excessiveness, finding friends like Bridget who can meet me on my level, and like letting us hang out alone, because when we're with other people, it's too much for them. And it's not, for me, it's not about what they're thinking when we're being those like big crazy versions of ourselves. It's how am I making that person feel? if they're an introvert, if they're small, if their space is smaller and I'm taking up the room, that's not fair. It's selfish. So it's like adjusting that angle to go, you're allowed to have a big personality, but accept it, be aware of it, and then be mindful of how that affects other humans and just be empathetic to their situation. And, you know, and that's the angle I'm trying to work. I've had a mom who lived through it going the other way. And I think you've really taught me that, where we've talked about this recently, where you're like, God, like when Bridget and I were kids, the amount of times you and Janet were like, shh, quiet, you're being too loud, you're being too loud. And I think as little kids, there's like a different way you can approach that.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay, you didn't know any better. But like, I know I'm going to have a loud, ambunctious, I was going to say robust. Isn't that like...
Isn't that boobs?
Isn't that boobs? I'm not a wordsmith. Like a big personality, a child with a big personality. And I want to figure out what is that language? Like, is it saying to the child, you know, I know you're really excited. I know you're feeling, you know, let's give you that space to do that, but not in the grocery store at 10 a.m. Well, there's a grandma in it, like, you know what I mean? Or not in the coffee shop or not in church. Like, find a different space. To like put that energy out, which you did do. Like Bridget and I both went into theater, and I think that was a great place for us to explode all of the energy we had in our bodies.
I think one of the best things about being in your 20s is that when you're in your 20s, you have the freedom to be out away from your parents, who aren't going to say, shh, you're being too loud. And when you're in your 20s and you're out there being loud, people kind of expect you to be like, it's kind of being in your 20s is really the time to let if you are that extroverted kind of, let your cheetah go, let her run.
Yeah. What advice would you offer to 20-year-olds today?
Or people in their 20s?
I think it's just what we've already talked about. Try to change the messaging in your own brain, the story you tell yourself. Stop worrying about what people think and start thinking about, you know, if you're standing in a room and you're thinking, oh, I'm the fattest person in the room, what is everybody going to think? Really kind of change that narrative in your head to, I'm in a room with a bunch of people, and what you know, how am I impacting them? Just like, because nobody's looking, we all think everybody's looking at us. Nobody's looking at us. Everybody's in the room worried about what people are thinking about them, right? So when people say, and I'm guilty of this, of saying, you know, oh, I don't worry about what people think, but it's not that. We all naturally go there, but change the narrative to how are you impacting others? Be curious about others as opposed to that it's all about you. And in your 20, you are still a bit egocentric. Like that's still a big thing, right? But we lose a lot of time. And I think given social media, people are losing more time with that concern. And the biggest thing we've taught, you know, people talk about this all the time, even in your 20s, and maybe it'll change if the world opens up, when the world opens up. Our phone isn't a relationship.
Put down the phones.
Put down the phones. Put down the phones. If you're in the same house and you're texting each other, I don't know if you do this, Bridget, but if you're upstairs at your mother's house and she's downstairs, walk down the stairs, get your steps in. Don't
get your steps in. Love that. Well, thanks so much for coming and chatting with us today, Brenda. I find that you and Mary have this incredible way of conversing because you can both, you know, throw in metaphors and different perspectives and stories and still go and tie up your thoughts all into like one little pretty bow at the end. My mom and I are both flabbergasted by it. And it was really interesting for me to get to know more about you and your story. You would think that I would know all of that, seeing as you changed my diapers, but I guess I never asked. So if people want to get in contact with you, they can reach out to Mary and I, and we can make that connection happen. So this has been an extra special episode of Talking 20 with Mary's mom, Brenda Courtney. As always, any feedback on the episode is always appreciated, so we can make sure that we keep creating things that you want to hear. Follow and subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening on. This, along with rates and reviews, seriously help us to grow the podcast, so this is the best way to show your support. We would also love if you followed along with our journey on Facebook and Instagram at Talking 20 Podcast. Thanks for listening.
Bye.
Love you, Mom.